Welcome, everybody.
Hello, colleagues. Welcome to the 2021.
A big warm welcome to this session, which is on democratic values and global action. My name is Frances O'Grady, and it is fantastic for the TUC to be welcoming you all and to chair the L7. I want to welcome our speakers. We have Trumka, Reema Nanavaty, Patrick Roach and Guy Ryder, a stellar lineup. They've each got 8 minutes to set out their thoughts. And then at the end, we hope to have 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer. So please do start posting your questions now and get them in early. Just a couple of words from me. We're really pleased that the G7 says it wants to promote shared democratic values. But nevertheless, it's true that unions and wider civic society often feel under real pressure in many of our countries. We've also seen the rise of the radical right, the far right, in some countries, and we know the economic conditions within which the far right thrives. We want to see economic democracy too, because we know that that delivers more solidarity and community cohesion, more equality, more power voice. And that's why trade unions are essential of democracy that need to be nurtured and supported. So it is also really welcome to hear President Biden speak so powerfully and eloquently about supporting trade unions to thrive, to grow, and to spread collective bargaining. And that's my link to our first speaker, Trumka. He's been president of the AFL-CIO since 2009. He is a tireless fighter for economic and social justice. And he's also been an incredibly good friend and an all-round decent human being to many movements, our own, but also around the world. So a big warm welcome to Rich. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Frances, let me just say how grateful I am for your tremendous leadership in the UK and globally. It's an honor to join so many good friends. And I want to thank all the TUC staff for organizing and hosting this G7 meeting. And thank you to the TUAC and ITUC colleagues who ensure working people have a strong, united voice at the G7 table. And I want to say what an honor it is to be with such a distinguished group of worker advocates, Patrick Roach, Reema Nanavaty, and my dear friend, Guy Ryder. Together, my colleagues today embody the fundamental bonds that link working people around the world, from rural India to British classrooms to the global community of the International Labour Organization. Today, more than ever before, we live, for better or worse, the common fate of working people. No matter where you're joining us from this afternoon, the awful suffering of the working poor in India under COVID-19 could be your suffering tomorrow. Biology respects no borders. And that's the lesson of the past year, that we truly live on one planet, no matter how wealthy or privileged we are. The labor ministers of the G7, the world's wealthiest democracies, meet this week in the United Kingdom at a moment of profound suffering and of new hope, a true collective crossroads. Because neoliberal global order, the neoliberal global order, an order based on corporate power, impoverishing workers, and crippling democratic government, an order founded on the idea that Margaret Thatcher put to words when she said that there is no such thing as society. That neoliberal order has utterly failed. It's now time for a new social contract, one founded on solidarity and democracy, on the understanding that our fates are indeed bound together, one that rests on the right of working people to organize and make our voices heard at work and in the workings of our government, from the local level to the global level. But first, let's measure the gigantic scale of the neoliberal catastrophe. Neoliberalism's decade-long attack on both government's capacity and on the public's faith in government has led to a runaway global pandemic, a failure on the part of the world's governments to address the rapidly escalating threat that climate change poses to civilization because they waited for private sector solutions that never came. The rise of authoritarian regimes and authoritarian personalities around the world who offer the politics of the 1930s, complete with massive human rights violations, as a solution to the neoliberal effort to bring back the economies of the 1920s. The lesson here is we must turn away from the neoliberal corporate-dominated model of globalization, and we must embrace a model founded on democracy and solidarity and a global agenda to address the many challenges our countries face. Here are the facts that the global policymakers must address. In 2020 alone, working people lost the equivalent of 255 million jobs worldwide due to COVID-19 pandemic. And we know the suffering was uneven across countries and geographies. Over 2 billion workers in the informal economy had to contemplate choosing to die from hunger or from the virus. And no worker should face such a decision. Today, 70% of people worldwide have no access to universal social protection. Hundreds of millions of working people are living on the margin. And despite that, the world is 3 times richer than it was just 20 years ago. But the challenge is more than an economic challenge or a public health challenge. The challenge is fundamentally political. When working people see that the rules of the economy don't work for them, they lose trust in the democratic system that were built to serve their needs. This is a lesson of the financial crisis, when government and after government doubled down on neoliberal austerity policies, only to see authoritarian nationalism political movements rise in every country that took that path. But the foundation of a new democratic globalism, a new global social contract, has been laid by working people ourselves in this crisis. Working people who are risking our lives and health, caring for the sick and dying, growing and harvesting the food and moving it to the kitchen table of billions of people. The working people who are keeping our transit systems moving. We show what really makes the world work. It's not the greed of CEOs who keep taking the big payouts, but it's the courage and solidarity of the working people who actually do the work. Now, it's those values, those voices that must define the future that we must build together, because we'll not re-emerge from the rubble unless we all do. That requires us to make structural change, both in our individual countries and on our global institutions. Economic, political, and social change. And that change requires workers to be participants in that change so that we're at the decision-making tables. We need to transform social dialogue to economic and political power. The alternative is a world dominated by greed and barbarism, a Bolsonaro world. So as the G7 leaders come together this week, working people must make sure the new policies they create don't just work for a select few, but rather work for every worker in every country. Now, I must say with a little renewed pride that my country, the United States, has some very positive examples to contribute. The Biden administration has shed the shackles of neoliberalism in concrete and meaningful ways for America's working people. The American Rescue Plan, which is now the law of the land in the US, is $1.9 trillion in COVID-19 relief. Survival checks to put money in 85% of people's pockets. Support for critical public services. Resources we need to ensure that kids and educators are safe in the classrooms. The American Rescue Plan is going to cut child poverty in half. And the American Rescue Plan is not only good for America, but good for the world. The OECD estimates that it will increase GDP in the world's major economies between 1.5% and more in countries that trade heavily with the US. And now President Biden's public investment proposals are on the table. And they're worth other countries looking at. They're at a scale we need, the scale to drive prosperity in the 21st century and take on climate change. And they understand what is obvious after COVID-19, that infrastructure includes education and healthcare. President Biden's proposals are expressly tied to the structural labor law reform, the PRO Act, which will bring working people back to the table in American society. And it's not coincidence that the US commitment to radical reduction in carbon emissions comes along with the public investment commitment and that commitment to workers' rights. Because public investment that creates good jobs, is the only way to effectively fight climate change. And empowering workers is the only way to get the public support to fight climate change. My friends, in the US and around the world, now is the time to create more policies that work for the migrant domestic worker and the construction worker and the street vendor and the teacher. Now is not a time to return to the failed policies of austerity. Now is the time to strengthen shared democratic values, because a stable democracy not only includes working people, a stable democracy ensures that working people benefit from the prosperity that we create every day. And democracy is only safe when, as we've heard from President Biden, working people have a social contract that provides workers with a fair shot to get ahead. And this week, the G7 has the chance to take concrete actions to build a new social contract, one based on solidarity and democracy. See, the escalating crisis in two of the world's largest emerging economies, Brazil and India, show how vulnerable the world's poorest people are in this moment. The G7 needs to respond by creating a global social protection fund, which would ensure that the poorest countries in the world could rebuild their economies in a way that ensures they're resilient. See, we need the G7's leadership to support the US call for a global minimum corporate tax rate. And that tax rate needs to be 25%, no less. So let's finally level the playing field and prevent the race to the bottom that's prevented countries from building social protection systems. Because if we do not address taxes, if we do not end the neoliberal regime built on corporate tax evasion, we can't address inequality. We cannot address climate and will not be any better prepared for the next pandemic than we were the last. Because taxes are a kind of map of power. Who has the power to get away with not paying their fair share? And in the world's tax system, we see runaway inequality of power. Let me say this. We won't solve inequality of wealth and wages or inequality of opportunity until we solve inequality of power. Simply put, global corporations and billionaires are too powerful and working people across the globe are too weak. And at the core of the threat that democracy now faces around the world, because the core of inequality is a real sense of indignity. It fuels pain and instills distrust. It opens the floodgates to scapegoating and scare tactics. And that's how extreme levels of inequality destabilize our democratic institutions. And we're approaching a tipping point. And that point is closer than some may choose to believe. A system that does not work for working people will not last. Implosion becomes inevitable. And that's why the enemies of democracy are more often than not anti-worker politicians. We know why they attack us. Because democracy and the labor movement are one and the same. Without workplace democracy and the labor movement, there would be no democracy. In every democracy, working people only have the vote because we organized as working people and fought for it. In America, we have a generational opportunity to change that. It's called the PRO Act. The PRO Act would allow America's workers to form a union freely and fairly. President Biden strongly supports the PRO Act. It's already passed the U.S. House of Representatives. All this week, all across America, in thousands of actions, working people are taking to the streets, physically and virtually, to demand that the U.S. Senate pass the PRO Act. We know that the vision reflected in the PRO Act reflects the priorities of workers around the world, advocating for strong, inclusive labor laws and social policies that protect their rights and strengthen their collective power. And we know that the PRO Act is more than labor law reform. It's an economic stimulus, it's civil rights legislation, and it's democracy reform. Brothers and sisters, democracy is fragile. It's not promised to the next generation. It's passed on by each one. We saw in January how fragile democracy is in the United States. Let's not make that mistake elsewhere. Without democracy, we know what happens. Working people go from being citizens to being subjects. So the choice for the leaders of the G7 is this: repeat the same neoliberal policies that create division, decline, and destabilization, or work with working people to rewrite the rules of our economy and politics so that we can defeat COVID and climate change and build a 21st century worth our children inheriting. The choice could not be clearer and the stakes could not be higher. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you very much indeed for that. Inspiring words and plenty to think about and get your questions coming in, not least about how do we level up and even that playing field in terms of corporation influence over our politics compared to trade unions. Our next speaker is an incredible participant in this session, Reema Nanavaty. She is the General Secretary of India's Self-Employed Women's Association, the largest union informal workers organisation in India, nearly 2 million women workers. Reema is a member of the World Bank's Gender Advisory Council, but I also just want to say that as a young woman activist, Reema, your organisation was such an inspiration to me. So really looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you so much. And dear Sister Francis, Brother Guy, Ryder, Brother Richard, Patrick, and thank you TUC for organizing this crucial meeting. I speak here on behalf of our 2 million women workers, all in the informal sector. The current state of the global pandemic has pushed majority of the workers in the global south in the informal sector. Today, my country, India, is experiencing a very destructive second wave of COVID, which is spreading at a galloping speed across the cities and the villages. We all have seen that the economy and the cities have been very unfair to the urban informal sector workers. May they be the migrant workers who had to rush back to their homes as if the city was not their home for safety and protection, including social protection. The cities and economy have also been unfair to the informal sector who have been residents in the slums and low-income settlements. The above two constitutes overwhelming majority of the urban workforce in countries like ours. The above two's contribution to economic growth is far more than the industrial sector, the formal sector. And this is odd because those who run and expand our cities and economy are left without any protection and preparedness. Therefore, I feel and I would stress upon an urgent need to organize the informal sector workers, as organizing is the surest way to fight poverty and exploitation. The pandemic has taught us two lessons. If we are ready and wish to learn, the virus does not see any color, class, race, or religion. It affects one and all. Therefore, the need for all the more need for coming together, building solidarity, building our collective strength as workers in the informal sector. Second, the current economic model of development has failed completely to protect or support the poor and the women in the informal sector, the vulnerable. While we carve out a new economic pathway, it needs to build an economy of nurturance, which is caring, sharing, green, and not exploitative, as we are experiencing currently. Therefore, I feel that this session is very timely and relevant. I will like to emphasize on about two principles and four pillars on which we need to rebuild our future as workers and as informal sector workers. Simplicity, as we very firmly believe and it now that adding complexity is not progress at all. Non-violence, as poverty is also a form of violence against individuals, nature, and society. When there is inequality or poverty, there is exploitation of the workers, of the environment, and of the community. Dignity of labor has to be maintained. Labor is the law of nature, and its violation is the central cause of the current economic muddle that we all are seeing. Human values, nothing that compromises a person's humanity is acceptable. Then only the workers in the informal sector, especially the women workers, can experience the real economic freedom. We also need to see whether vaccine alone is the solution for the workers. What are the other demands or needs of the workers, especially the women workers related to COVID and beyond COVID, in terms of health, nutrition, security, and livelihoods? Work and society balance has to be maintained, and does it increase the strength of the workers in the informal economy has to be properly monitored. How do we plan for decent jobs and work and production that are opportunities to or that become opportunities to organize or reorganize so that more employment is generated? The opportunities help bring governance rules along with work, identity cards for the workers, labor market stimulation. I would therefore make two strong demands to the labor ministers, and I'm sure TUC would push for it, and that is rapid unrolling of universal social protection for all workers, including the workers in the informal sector. The second is that universal social protection is not possible unless the workers have a universal minimum income. And a minimum income is not possible unless there is basic livelihood support. Therefore, I think there is a need to build up a large scale investment in livelihood funds for women workers. And I'm sure that together, I think we will therefore be able to build an economy which is a nurturing economy and which is a green economy and not an exploitative economy for the workers. Thank you so much.
so much, Reema. We've now got our next speaker, who is Patrick Roach. Now, if there's any threat to democratic values and democracy, it's got to be the threat of white supremacy and racism. Now, Patrick is the leader of one of our big teacher unions, NASWUT, but he's also chair of the TUC's task group on anti-racism. So you're very welcome, Patrick, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Francis, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's fantastic to be joining this very distinguished panel today. In April last year, the Labour7 called on the G7 to lead on a coordinated response to COVID-19. And since that time, we've seen how communities worldwide have been devastated by a deadly virus, which has triggered an economic emergency and a crisis for democracy. It's also exposed a racial justice emergency that requires a coordinated response by governments and international institutions with social partners to step up, to develop measures that will tackle the root causes of perennial systemic disparities which continue to stifle prosperity, threaten democracy, and undermine our security. Today, workers continue to be exposed to enormous risks. In hospitals, care homes, schools and colleges, in retail, manufacturing, utilities, transport and distribution, key workers are working hard to keep the public safe. And they want good jobs, safe jobs. But we know that for those workers who are of Black or Asian heritage or from other ethnic minority communities, they're up to 4 times more likely to die at work due to the coronavirus. In the UK, Black and Asian workers are 2 times more likely to be unemployed, paid less than their white counterparts, more likely to be fired, more likely to be working in precarious jobs on 0 hours contracts. Black women in the UK are 2 times more likely to be employed in insecure jobs compared to white women, 3 times more likely than white men. These are the workers who are on the front line in keeping us safe during the pandemic. And across the board, young people and Black workers in the UK have borne the brunt of job losses during the pandemic, with the employment rate of Black workers falling 26 times faster than for white workers in the UK since the start of the pandemic. And we must also maintain our fight against all forms of hatred and the rise of the far right, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The UK presidency of the G7 aims to unite our democracies, to build back better from the coronavirus and create a greener, more prosperous future. But we say we must go further. It must also be our shared ambition to advance equality and inclusion, to level up and to take concerted action to strengthen workplace democracy and tackle discriminations on the grounds of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or migrant status. And the pursuit of equality and an inclusive future for all starts in our workplaces, where the voice of workers must be listened to and respected. And that has to start with a commitment, a clear plan with measurable action. In the last year, we heard many warm words from governments and political leaders worldwide praising the efforts of key workers. But if we're to emerge together from the pandemic, action is needed nationally and internationally to demonstrate the value the public has placed on the contribution made by all key workers, by committing to decent jobs and working conditions, and by delivering real increases in public investment in health and social care, education, and other public services that are so vital to the safety of our communities and to securing prosperity for all of us. The G7 has the opportunity to commit to an international plan to tackle systemic racism and other forms of discrimination, educating for democracy, and also strengthening commitment to labour rights, social dialogue, and collective bargaining. The pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have laid bare the deep wounds and scars of racism. The racist killing of George Floyd and many, many others must be a turning point. The conviction of the killer of George Floyd delivered justice, but racial justice remains at work in our economy and labour markets, in our political and social institutions, and we must never shirk from our responsibility to tackle it. And we must also reject the deniers of racism with the same vigour and conviction as we reject the politics of the climate change deniers, and instead we must press for change. And if governments are serious, they must step up with a clear plan to confront systemic and institutional racism. You know, this last year has demonstrated the deep desire of trade unions, workers, families, communities, young and old, to end the searing injustice of racism once and for all. And our trade unions, as the largest representative membership organisations, are working together on behalf of millions of workers to move the dial, to turn the page, ready to bring forward transformational ideas and solutions that will make the difference. And that's what the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force has been established to do, working across the UK with union leaders and civil society organisations. Our Anti-Racism Task Force is working to open up the democratic space, engaging with black and white workers to bring forward a programme of measurable actions that address the challenges that we face, organising and supporting workers, ensuring that we lead by example, and taking steps to set a progressive agenda that will tackle racism at work and secure decent rights for all workers. And our ask is for governments, institutions and employers to engage in constructive dialogue to ensure that our workplaces everywhere are safe places, to advance fair employment practice, and to ensure that the voice of all workers are at the table as governments bring forward their plans for a just, equitable and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. Following the first national lockdown in the UK in March last year, the government rightly moved to bring workers and unions to the table. Well, that same commitment is needed today. Social dialogue and collective bargaining must define our approach, and as unions, we stand ready to work with governments, institutions and employers, ready to work with governments and employers to address racism and all forms of injustice in the world of work, and to release the potential, the creativity within our communities, which will be key to securing a just, sustainable and prosperous future for us all. And that must begin by ensuring that the right of unions to organise in the workplace, to train and upskill the workforce, and to ensure that the right of workers to join a union is not only respected, but also encouraged. And as the leader of a trade union representing teachers, the NASWT, it's also incumbent upon me to say that we should always take the opportunity to learn lessons from the responsible and pragmatic example set by trade unions who've worked with governments and employers to protect jobs and incomes, and with our members to keep vital services going during the most challenging and dangerous periods in our history. And we need G7 leaders to have the courage to continue that work with social partners, including trade unions, to tackle the inequalities that deny opportunity and hold back prosperity, including through the use of mandatory equalities reporting and robust enforcement, protecting the right to safety at work and the right to be protected from all forms of discrimination, regardless of how you're employed or the job that you do, raising labour standards and insisting on stronger social protections that benefit everyone. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has dominated our lives this past year, but it must never define us or disrupt our shared values and our commitment to democracy, decency, to equality and social justice. Anti-racist and anti-discrimination policies must be part of the G7 agenda in response to the evidence of long-term discrimination and in the wake of the protests that we've seen across G7 countries and beyond. If we're to secure the safety and prosperity of our workplaces, our communities, our countries, and our planet, the voices of all workers, black and white, must be part of the conversation in our workplaces and with governments. And our unions are determined to be part of that conversation. And we look now to G7 leaders to confirm their commitment to a coordinated response to the health, economic, and racial justice emergency that we face today, and to work together with us to protect our futures and our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Such a for democracy to thrive by ending racism and all forms of discrimination, a call for courage on the part of the G7 leaders, and of course, for a seat at the table for trade unions as the organisations of working people, not just in a crisis. I hope that will have prompted a lot of questions. Please get them posted so that we can take them in the discussion after our final speaker, who is Guy Ryder. Now, Guy has been Director General of the ILO since 2012. Back in the dim and distant past, Guy was also a TUC staffer, one of our best exports, but he's also done a lot of thinking about the future of work and the future of democracy. Over to you, Guy, and a big warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Francis. Great to be back with the TUC, if not at the TUC today. And I have to say that I benefit greatly from having listened to the very compelling interventions already from Rich, from Reema and Patrick. And, you know, a lot of the things I've thought about saying in this intervention have already been said. And instead of repeating what my colleagues have said, let me just add a couple of other perspectives on the debate that we're having and the issues that stand before us. I think the first thing to note, I look at the caption of our discussion. It is somewhat alarming, is it not, that in this forum, we're having to focus our attention on the defense of democratic values and promote global action. It's distressing because it's a comment on our circumstances, but it's absolutely necessary. Think of this, and it underlines the responsibilities of G7 leaders this week and in the future. Of course, these G7 leaders are all the leaders, elected leaders, whatever you may think of them, of rich, prosperous democracies in the world. When those 7 people sit down at the G20 table later in the year, the majority of the other leaders sitting at the table, not just some, the majority, will have no identification with the democratic values or a very marginal connection with the democratic values that we're talking about today. It's a comment on our times, and it also serves to underline the importance of what the G7 leaders say, and more importantly, what they do. Now, this circumstance now combines with the continuing pandemic in which the world continues to be immersed, and sharing a platform with Reema reminds us of the drama playing out in her country right now. We're not out of this pandemic, but it's not too early to think about what economic recovery can look like in the year or the second or the 2 years ahead. Here's the bad news. The pandemic itself, which has been devastating, you've heard the numbers, 255 million job equivalents lost, 8.3% wiped off labour income in the last year. And I could mention more figures, 108 million more people now pushed back into poverty, increases in child labour, increases in forced labor around the world. The impact of this pandemic has been massively unequal. We've heard from Patrick how it's affected Black and ethnic minority workers. Exactly the same points apply to women, apply to young people, apply to the lower paid in general. The fact of the matter is, the better off you were in the labour market going into this pandemic, the better off you're coming out of it as well. A tremendous effect to create and to increase already dramatic levels of inequality is what we've seen over the last 15 months. And added to that is the predicted trajectories for recovery now will only deepen internationally those inequalities further. The G7 countries, the advanced countries, are likely to get back somewhere to where they should have been absent the pandemic in terms of economic growth by the end of next year. For the developing world, for the emerging world, it's a very different story. They are being scarred in a very enduring way in the longer term. So absent deliberate, focused efforts internationally to correct that type of inequality, what we're going to see is the absolute opposite of building back better. We will be building back more unequal and indeed more unsafe because, as Rich Trumka has indicated earlier on, this type of trajectory does not provide security for anybody at all. So the challenges before us are to create a different future of work. You've mentioned, Francis, that the ILO in its centenary focused very heavily on the future of work. We had already traced out in that work a different future of work, a future of work which would provide decent work opportunities for all, and in so doing would remove that field in which populist politics and racist politics prospers. A future of work where investment in people and their capabilities, universal social protection, lifelong learning opportunities, genuine agenda for gender equality, investment in the jobs of the future, the green jobs that we need, the care economy, infrastructure, and the agricultural sector too, and investment in the institutions of work, which are the mechanisms which provide guarantees for people's fundamental rights, be it collective bargaining, be it the right to organize. That's the future of work that we saw for the world in the years ahead. And the challenge before us, and why not start with the G7, is to make sure that the recovery process that we need to get into motion builds in all of these elements, that it's a green recovery process, that it's a recovery process that is positive for greater equity at work and social justice. It's an agenda which builds in the rights of working people. That would lead us to the type of future that trade unions have fought for as long as any of us can remember, and from which the world would certainly benefit. I actually think, despite the level of authoritarian governments which exist in the world today, that we have real reason for hope. We see what Rich Trumka has said about the messages that are coming out of the United States today, important for us all. Let's generalize that but beyond the perspectives of a single country. People are seeing the future differently. COVID-19 has made us all aware of our own mortality, of the dangers that we all face, of our vulnerabilities. It's made us aware too that if we're going to construct credible responses to what are global challenges, we have to act multilaterally. We have to act in cooperation with each other. The mindset which says simply my country first is simply not compatible with the types of responses we need to address the challenges which are common to us all from now on. Trade unions have a internationalist reflex. It's built into trade unionism. It's built into trade unionists. And I think that that's a message that the L7 could very usefully deliver to the G7. And let's hope that they're, on this occasion, listening. And I hope also as well that it's been useful listening to me. Thanks very much, Francis.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was absolutely brilliant. And I also think a really important to each of us that we're not just talking about within our own about, and this has got to be about tackling worldwide, including in countries too. Now, I've got some questions, and I think we've got 15 minutes sharp, a little less, to get through them. But so the first one is from Tony. Private sector union. He asks, what can the G7 say? Jobs ban, and President Biden on decent work and unionized jobs. Is there something that other G7 countries need to learn? Which could kick us off that?
Well, we know this, that we have to do a transition from a global economy to a less carbon footprint. And that means there's going to be job loss and there's going to be job creation. The jobs that are created won't necessarily be good jobs unless we have the opportunity to unionize them and make them good jobs. So they have to understand that workers need to have a transition from good jobs to good jobs. The second thing is, when jobs are destroyed in one area, frequently we say, oh, we lost 100 jobs here, but look, 1,000 miles away, we created 100 jobs. That doesn't do anything for the 100 people that lost their jobs. So we really have to match investment with the areas where the job loss transfers from. And if workers don't participate, don't get to participate through having a voice on the job in a union and collective bargaining so we can get a bigger share of what we produce, it's a threat to democracy. And I'll very, very briefly do this. I know we're short on time. Inequality, and that's inequality of wealth and wages, inequality of opportunity that Patrick talked about, and inequality of power are putting us on a trajectory to implosion because the system works for fewer and fewer people. If we don't reverse that trend, the assault on democracy will continue and will cause an implosion at the end of that. The lesson to be learned is inequality. All three phases of it are absolutely essential for us to address and the G7 to address. And you can't address inequality of opportunity and inequality of wages without addressing inequality of power. And that means giving workers more say, more decision-making, and more opportunity to form a union.
Reema, India, a very different situation. What prospect do you think there might be for the same kind of commitment to what President Biden calls union jobs? You might be able to, will any of that kind of magic in India? Or what?
Well, I think India, the situation is quite unpredictable at the moment. The government is in no mood to strengthen or support the unions. In a way, it is trying to crush the civil society, the unions, which we all know. And therefore, I think what we are experiencing is a kind of a sophisticated autocratic government that we have, which is curbing the rights of the workers. The new labor code, the new social protection code, which are all coming out, the amendments in the farm laws. So it's going to be quite tough for the unions in India, especially also the unions like the informal sector workers unions. And but I think we are not losing hope. And we definitely feel that, you know, women are going to be the future. And amongst the women also, the unions of the women are going to be the future women workers. So I'm hopeful that, you know, the unions definitely would make the government learn from countries like the US, what the administration is trying to do for the unions. And I think we will not give up.
What do you think the chance? Are we at a crossroads? Are we going to see a paradigm shift towards a recognition of the importance of collective bargaining in redistributing power and wealth, or is this, you know, going to be a one-off in the States? Guy Ryder.
I thought you were addressing somebody else. Look, I think what I'm encouraged by, and I hope it's not wishful thinking, is that the experience of the pandemic has created new ways of thinking about some of the problems we've had for a long time. You know, I'm hearing discussions, for example, and it's been mentioned already, on global tax regimes, because we're going to have to fund this recovery process in ways that we haven't been ready to consider before. You're hearing new things coming even about how we organize trade. You know, when the incoming Director General of the World Trade Organization, not an organization that trade unions generally think they've had a very sympathetic hearing from, when she says that my organization is all about people and decent work, I think you can see that some tectonic plates are moving. I think also that the experience of the pandemic has just shown how unequal we are, not just in terms of, you know, where we are on the spectrum of income distribution. You know, we're living in different categories. We're living in different segments of society. Those whose kids have been able to keep their education going because they got computers at home. Those are, you know, able to live through this pandemic with the benefits of social protection, and those who simply have not. And I think this is generating change. Now, whether that comes through to the very basic issues, and they're basic and fundamental, of collective bargaining, of the right to organize, I think we have to see a lot of politics happening right now, a lot of politics changing. And I think trade unions will not be gifted these things, they never have been. But where trade unions are able to act in such ways as to win the fights, win the battles. Rich, we all watched what happened in Bessemer in Alabama in recent days. Not the result that was wanted, but surely a harbinger of better things to come. Then I think we can be optimistic, but it won't happen on its own. It's a lesson of 100 years of Labour history or more. We have to make it happen. But the opportunities are there. I've got no doubt about that. And can I just make that last plea for putting the international reflex into everything that we do? You know, $16 trillion have been spent. $16 trillion have been spent on keeping our economies moving over the last 15 months. In itself, that is a really impressive figure. But let's not be deceived by it. That has been spent nationally and understandably by countries to keep their economies going. It hasn't filtered down to the poorest countries, the least developed countries, who have basically had to defend for themselves and have not been able to do so. Now, we really will not, any of us, be out of this until we're all out of it. And that needs to inform our thinking.
Thanks very much, Guy. Question from Spence, just by the way, just to win Patrick, you know, from the creative industries point of view, but many industries that have large numbers of insecure workers. You know, Stephen was pointing out his membership, 40% of them didn't get any support whatsoever through this crisis. So much as we achieved through the furloughs and support for the self-employed schemes, lots of people fell through the net. But how optimistic are you that we're about to see a big shift in terms of government's understanding that, you know, unions are great working class institutions and they should be supported to thrive rather than attacked?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to be optimistic. We're in trade unions because of our eternal optimism. We fight to make a difference. That's what you know. It gets us up in the morning. That's what we're here to do. but no one's going to pretend that it is going to be easy. It's absolutely clear that, as we've seen over the course of the last year and a half, that we've all been caught in the same storm of this pandemic, but we've not all been in the same boat. And the question there, Francis, of those workers, those who are working in precarious jobs, have had to navigate this storm in a way which has been especially difficult for them. And despite our best efforts, the best efforts of the trade union movement, not only in the UK, but in countries around the world, to press governments to put in place social and income protections for those workers and their families who were most severely impacted by the pandemic, that made a huge difference. But, you know, we always know that we're going to have to go further, and not everybody was able to access those social protections. What we need is clearly leadership. And one of the other factors that gives me a cause for optimism is that there is some evidence that we are turning a page with regard to that political leadership. Guy made reference to it a few moments ago. Richard has teased us with the optimism that is emanating from the United States as a result of the leadership of the Biden administration. What we need to be pressing for is that political leadership, that leadership, that courage to call out the big issues, that leadership which is not about seeking to turn back the clock, as regrettably we've seen some evidence of in some countries, including in the UK, where the issues of equality and social justice has perhaps been downplayed. I'm being generous here. We need to redouble our efforts as a trade union movement, as we will do, to press governments at home and abroad to live up to the commitments that they have made, to live up to those commitments around fair work, around decent work, and to ensure that they honour those commitments in practice. That's the reason why, you know, we in the UK, with the TUC, through the work of the Anti-Racism Task Force and many other initiatives, are working to press home that point. And we will continue to make those arguments very strongly of our own government in terms of what it does at home, in respect of our own government in terms of what it does in supporting governments and countries overseas, but also working with our international sisters and brothers within our global trade union movement to really step up and make the difference to build an inclusive recovery from this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think we're 2 minutes away, which means I can't ask my question, which I wanted to ask about how we build democracy within our trade union movements for the digital age, what more we can do on that front. But I just want to thank all our brilliant speakers, everybody who's joined online, and the fantastic support from our organisers too. Thank you all very much indeed.